What if I told you that the most influential figure in human history wasn't born with divine power, but mastered 3 psychological laws that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to understand? For over 2,000 years, billions have followed one man's words, but the real secret isn't what he said. It's how he programmed the human mind to never forget him. Today, we're going to decode the hidden psychological architecture that made Jesus the ultimate master of influence. These aren't religious teachings, they're mind control techniques disguised as parables. And by the end of this video, you'll see exactly how 3 ancient strategies can rewire anyone's brain for maximum persuasion. If you're building influence in business, politics, or life, the most powerful psychological weapons in history have been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. These mind control secrets will change everything you know about persuasion. Here's what most people completely misunderstand about Jesus. They think his parables were simple stories designed to teach moral lessons. Wrong, dead wrong. What Jesus actually created was the most sophisticated psychological delivery system ever devised. A mental virus that could spread through any culture, any language, any time period, and embed itself so deeply in human consciousness that it would be impossible to remove. Think about this for a moment. Jesus spoke to mostly illiterate peasants in a tiny corner of the Roman Empire. No printing press, no internet, no mass media. Yet somehow, his exact words have survived and spread to every continent on Earth. How does a poor carpenter from Nazareth achieve what no emperor, no philosopher, no general in human history has ever accomplished? The answer isn't divine intervention. It's pure psychological engineering. When Jesus told parables, he wasn't just teaching, he was programming. Each story contained what cognitive scientists now call schema activation triggers, narrative structures that hijack the brain's pattern recognition system and force it to remember. But here's what's truly genius. He designed these stories to be incomplete. Every parable ends with a question mark burned into your subconscious. The Good Samaritan doesn't tell you what to do next. The prodigal son doesn't explain how the brothers reconciled. The mustard seed doesn't detail how the kingdom grows. This isn't accidental, it's strategic. Jesus understood something that modern psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, the human brain's obsession with unfinished patterns. When you hear a story without closure, your mind becomes a prison. It will replay that narrative over and over, filling in the gaps, personalizing the details, making the story yours. Jesus didn't want followers who simply agreed with him. He wanted people whose minds would be permanently rewired by his words. But the true masterstroke was this: he made every listener the hero of their own parable. You're not just hearing about the Good Samaritan, you are the person walking down that dangerous road. You're not just learning about forgiveness, you're the prodigal son returning home. This technique, which psychologists now call narrative transportation, doesn't just change your opinion, it changes your identity. The Roman Empire controlled through fear. Greek philosophers controlled through logic. Jesus controlled through story. And story is the only form of control that people beg you to give them more of now. Here's the psychological mechanism that made Jesus' parables so devastatingly effective, something that wasn't understood until neuroscientists started mapping the brain with fMRI machines in the 21st century. When Jesus told stories, he wasn't just activating the language centers of the brain. He was simultaneously firing up the visual cortex, the motor cortex, the emotional processing centers, and the memory consolidation networks. In other words, he was creating what scientists call embodied cognition, making people physically experience his teachings in their bodies, not just understand them intellectually. Let's examine the parable of the sower. Jesus describes a farmer scattering seeds on different types of ground. As he speaks, your brain automatically starts visualizing the scene. But here's the genius part. You're not just seeing the farmer, you're feeling the weight of the seeds in your hand, the resistance of rocky soil, the satisfaction of fertile ground. Neuroscientists have discovered that when we hear action words, our motor cortex fires as if we're actually performing those actions. But Jesus took this even further. He structured every parable around what psychologists call optimal cognitive load. Just enough complexity to engage your full attention, but simple enough that you could remember and retell it perfectly. The average parable contains exactly 3 main elements, uses familiar objects and situations, and follows a predictable narrative arc. This isn't coincidence. It's the exact formula that maximizes both comprehension and retention. Consider the parable of the lost sheep. 1 shepherd, 99 safe sheep. 1 lost sheep. The brain loves these numerical patterns because they create what cognitive scientists call processing fluency. The story feels true because it's easy to understand. But within this simple structure, Jesus embedded profound psychological anchors. The shepherd in the story doesn't just represent God. He represents the idealized version of yourself. When you hear this parable, your brain automatically casts you in the role of someone who would abandon everything to save the lost. You're not being told to be compassionate, you're being programmed to see yourself as inherently compassionate. This is identity-level persuasion, and it's virtually impossible to resist. Jesus also understood something that modern influence experts call social proof through narrative. Instead of saying you should help others, he told stories about people who naturally helped others. Instead of commanding be forgiving, he showed forgiveness in action. The human brain treats vivid stories as real experiences. So these fictional examples became psychological evidence of how good people actually behave. But perhaps most brilliantly, Jesus made every parable simultaneously personal and universal. The lost sheep works whether you're the shepherd, the found sheep, or the one still lost. The prodigal son resonates whether you're the wayward child, the faithful brother, or the forgiving father. This multi-layered identification system meant that people at every stage of life, in every circumstance, could find themselves in his stories. This is why Jesus' influence transcended culture, class, and century. He wasn't teaching religion, he was programming the fundamental operating system of human psychology. Let me break this down with an analogy that will make everything crystal clear. Think of the human mind like a computer. Most people try to influence others by sending email, direct commands that go to the conscious inbox and get immediately filtered, deleted, or ignored. Jesus didn't send emails. He created viruses. A parable is like a perfectly designed piece of malware that bypasses all your mental firewalls. It arrives disguised as entertainment. Just an innocent story about a farmer or a shepherd. Your conscious mind welcomes it in because stories aren't threatening. But once inside, this virus begins rewriting your core programming. The story embeds itself in your visual memory. You can see the farmer. Your emotional memory, you feel for the lost sheep. Your motor memory, you imagine walking down that road. And your social memory, you identify with the characters. Now it's not just in your head. It's integrated into your entire nervous system. And here's the truly insidious part. Unlike a regular computer virus that tries to hide, this psychological virus makes you want to spread it. You feel compelled to retell the story, to share the lesson, to pass it on. Jesus created the world's first viral content, literally. Every time you retell a parable, you're not just sharing a story. You're strengthening its neural pathways in your own brain and implanting the same virus into someone else's mind. This is why these 2,000-year-old stories feel as fresh and relevant today as they did in ancient Palestine. They're not just surviving, they're evolving, adapting, finding new hosts in every generation. Modern marketers spend billions trying to create sticky content that people remember and share. Jesus did it with zero budget, using nothing but the hidden architecture of human psychology. He understood that the most powerful form of influence isn't changing what people think. It's changing how they think. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit subscribe. What comes next will shatter your understanding of influence. Now let's examine Jesus' second law of psychological dominance. And this one will disturb you because you'll recognize it in every manipulative person you've ever encountered. Most people think Jesus was all about abundance, love, and acceptance. But look closer at his actual methods, and you'll discover something much darker. Jesus was a master of artificial scarcity. He deliberately created psychological hunger, then positioned himself as the only source of satisfaction. This isn't speculation. It's documented behavior that modern psychologists recognize as intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive reward schedule ever discovered. Casinos use it. Social media platforms use it. Abusive relationships thrive on it. And Jesus perfected it 2,000 years before we had names for these techniques. Consider how Jesus operated. He didn't set up a permanent school like other teachers. He didn't write books or create institutions. Instead, he moved constantly, appearing and disappearing unpredictably. When crowds gathered, he would often slip away without warning. When people begged him to stay, he would say he had to go to other towns. He made his presence a scarce resource. But it gets more sophisticated. Jesus didn't just create scarcity around his physical presence, he created scarcity around understanding itself. Remember his disciples constantly asking him to explain his parables? That wasn't because they were stupid. It was because Jesus deliberately spoke in riddles, making clarity something you had to earn, not something freely given. To those who have been given the secret of the kingdom of God, Jesus said, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables so that they may be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Read that again. Jesus openly admitted that he used confusing language to keep people in the dark, while offering special knowledge only to his inner circle. This is textbook cult psychology. Create confusion and dependency, then offer yourself as the solution. Make people feel lost, then become their guide. Generate questions only you can answer, problems only you can solve. Jesus also mastered what psychologists call fear of missing out, FOMO, centuries before the term existed. His teachings were full of warnings about narrow gates, limited time, and exclusive opportunities. The kingdom of heaven is like a banquet, he would say, but when the invited guests don't come, the door is shut. Translation: act now or lose forever. Even his miracles followed this pattern. Jesus didn't heal everyone who asked. He didn't feed every hungry crowd. He selected specific people for specific demonstrations, making divine intervention appear rare and unpredictable. This scarcity model made every healing feel like a lottery win rather than an expected service. The psychological effect was devastating. People didn't just want Jesus's teachings, they craved them. They didn't just appreciate his presence, they became addicted to it. He created a psychological dependency that outlasted his physical life by 2 millennia. Here's the neuroscience behind why Jesus' scarcity tactics were so psychologically devastating, and why they still control millions of minds today. When something becomes scarce, your brain doesn't just want it more, it literally changes its chemical structure. Scarcity triggers the release of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction. But here's the key. Dopamine isn't actually the pleasure chemical, it's the seeking chemical. It creates craving, not satisfaction. Jesus understood this instinctively. By making his teachings, his presence, and his approval scarce and unpredictable, he was essentially turning his followers into addicts. Every time someone encountered him, their brain got a dopamine hit. But because they never knew when the next encounter would come, their minds remained in a constant state of seeking. Modern neuroscientists call this intermittent variable reinforcement, and it's the most powerful behavioral conditioning technique ever discovered. Slot machines use it, social media notifications use it, and Jesus pioneered it with his disciples. Look at how he handled Peter's famous declaration, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Most teachers would praise such understanding and build on it. Jesus did the opposite. One moment he's calling Peter blessed and promising him leadership. The next moment he's calling him Satan and rebuking him harshly. This isn't inconsistency, it's calculated psychological conditioning. When rewards and punishments become unpredictable, the brain becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning for approval. Peter didn't just respect Jesus, he became psychologically dependent on Jesus's validation. This is why Peter followed him to crucifixion and beyond, even after repeated failure and rejection. Jesus also weaponized what psychologists call social proof through exclusivity. He didn't just gather followers, he created an inner circle, a middle circle, and an outer circle. The 12 disciples, the 70 sent out, the crowds who listened. Each group was given different levels of access, different amounts of information, different degrees of intimacy. This hierarchical structure created what social scientists call aspiration pressure. Everyone in the outer circle wanted to be in the middle circle. Everyone in the middle circle wanted to be in the inner circle, and everyone in the inner circle was terrified of being demoted. Jesus made relationship with him feel like a competition where the stakes were eternal. Even his famous "love your enemies" teaching follows this scarcity model. Love becomes more precious because it's rare. Forgiveness becomes more powerful because it's unexpected. Grace becomes more valuable because it's undeserved. Jesus didn't just teach these concepts, he made them feel scarce and therefore irresistible. But perhaps most cunningly, Jesus created scarcity around time itself. "The kingdom of heaven is at hand," he declared, creating urgency. "I must work while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work," he warned, making every moment feel precious. This wasn't just theological messaging, it was psychological manipulation designed to prevent rational deliberation. When people feel time pressure, they make emotional decisions rather than logical ones. They commit before they're ready, believe before they're convinced, and follow before they understand where they're going. This temporal scarcity became the foundation of evangelical urgency that persists today. Jesus didn't just offer salvation, he made it feel rare, urgent, and almost impossible to obtain. And paradoxically, this made it infinitely more desirable than if he had simply offered it freely to everyone. Here's an analogy that will illuminate exactly how Jesus' scarcity tactics rewired human psychology. Imagine the human mind as a smartphone with limited battery and storage. Most teachers try to download their entire philosophy into your mental storage all at once, like trying to install a massive app that immediately fills up your memory and drains your battery. The result? Mental rejection, fatigue, and deletion. Jesus was different. He sent you tiny, mysterious notification pings throughout the day. A brief parable here, a cryptic saying there, a disappearing act just when you wanted more. Your mental phone wasn't overwhelmed, it was intrigued. But here's the genius part. These notifications were designed to be incomplete. Each one created what tech designers call a notification gap. You got just enough information to be curious, never enough to be satisfied. So your brain kept the app running in the background, constantly consuming mental energy, waiting for the next ping. And unlike other teachers who gave you the full download up front, Jesus made you earn each piece of content. Want to understand the parable? Join the inner circle. Want to see a miracle? Follow him to the next town. Want spiritual knowledge? Prove your dedication first. This turned his teachings into what app developers call freemium content. The basic version was available to everyone, but the premium features required commitment. And just like modern apps, once you started investing time and emotional energy into unlocking new levels, you became psychologically invested in continuing. The most addictive apps today use something called variable ratio reinforcement. You never know when you'll get the next reward, so you keep checking compulsively. Jesus pioneered this 2,000 years ago. His followers never knew when they'd get the next revelation, the next miracle, the next moment of approval. So they stayed constantly alert, constantly hoping, constantly seeking. Modern psychology calls this intermittent reinforcement addiction, and it's the foundation of every manipulative relationship, every cult, every abusive system. The victim becomes psychologically dependent on unpredictable rewards from the controller. Jesus didn't create followers, he created addicts. People who couldn't stop seeking his approval, couldn't stop craving his presence, couldn't stop hoping for the next spiritual hit. And the beautiful tragedy is that this addiction outlasted his physical presence by 2 millennia. If you're watching this far, you are different. Prove it. Like and subscribe for the mind-blowing secrets in my next videos. Now we arrive at Jesus' most sophisticated and disturbing psychological weapon. One so advanced that most people can't even recognize when it's being used against them. This is the technique that separates amateur manipulators from true masters of the human mind. Jesus didn't just use scarcity and storytelling to control people's thoughts. He used paradox to completely destroy their ability to think critically. And here's what makes this so sinister. He made people feel intelligent while actually disabling their rational faculties. Every great cult leader in history has used this technique. Every authoritarian regime has deployed it. Every abusive relationship relies on it. But Jesus didn't just use paradox, he weaponized it into a complete system of mental submission. Think about Jesus's most famous teachings, and you'll notice something disturbing. They're all logical contradictions. The first shall be last. To save your life, you must lose it. Blessed are the poor. Turn the other cheek. These aren't profound wisdom, they're cognitive viruses designed to shut down logical thinking. When your brain encounters a paradox, something fascinating happens. The logical centers of your mind become overwhelmed, trying to reconcile contradictory information. Unable to process the conflict rationally, your brain shifts into what psychologists call meaning-making mode. You stop analyzing and start believing. This is why smart people often fall for obvious scams and intelligent individuals join destructive cults. Paradox doesn't target the stupid, it targets the analytical. It uses your intelligence against you by giving your rational mind an impossible puzzle to solve, then offering emotional resolution while your logic is disabled. Jesus elevated this to an art form. He would present seemingly contradictory statements, watch his listeners struggle to understand, then offer himself as the key to resolution. "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he would say, positioning himself as the answer to the cognitive chaos he had deliberately created. But here's the most insidious part. Jesus made doubt itself feel like a moral failing. When people couldn't understand his paradoxes, he didn't clarify. He questioned their faith. "Oh, you have little faith," he would say. "Why do you doubt?" This created what psychologists call intellectual learned helplessness. People stopped trusting their own reasoning and started depending entirely on his authority. Consider the famous "render unto Caesar" response. When asked about paying taxes, Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." This sounds wise, but it's actually meaningless. He didn't answer the question. He created a paradox that sounds profound but provides no practical guidance. Yet people have been praising this wisdom for 2,000 years. This pattern repeats throughout his teachings. When asked about divorce, he gives contradictory answers. When questioned about the law, he both upholds and dismisses it. When challenged about his authority, he responds with riddles that sound deep but actually reveal nothing. The psychological effect was devastating. People couldn't pin him down, couldn't corner him with logic, couldn't expose his contradictions because contradiction was his method. He made inconsistency feel like transcendence and confusion feel like enlightenment. Now here's the neurological mechanism that explains why Jesus' paradox strategy was so devastatingly effective at creating lifelong mental submission and why it's still controlling millions of minds today. When your brain encounters a logical contradiction, it creates what neuroscientists call cognitive dissonance, a state of mental stress caused by holding conflicting ideas simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, rational thinking would resolve this dissonance by rejecting false information and accepting what makes logical sense. But Jesus short-circuited this natural process through what psychologists call authority-based resolution. Instead of letting people solve contradictions through reason, he positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of truth. The message became clear. When logic fails, trust Jesus. When reason falters, have faith. When understanding breaks down, submit to authority. This creates a profound psychological dependency. Every time someone encounters a paradox in Jesus' teaching and chooses faith over reason, they're training their brain to defer to his authority rather than their own analytical capabilities. It's like deliberately damaging your mental immune system so that future infections of illogical thinking can spread without resistance. Modern neuroscience has revealed exactly how this process works. When people repeatedly override their logical objections for religious reasons, the neural pathways responsible for critical thinking actually weaken through disuse. Meanwhile, the brain regions associated with emotional comfort and social belonging strengthen. Over time, questioning feels uncomfortable while believing feels natural. Jesus understood this instinctively. His paradoxes weren't random. They were strategically designed to target the specific cognitive processes that might threaten his authority. Consider how he handled challenges to his power. When asked by what authority he cleansed the temple, he responded with a question about John the Baptist that had nothing to do with the original inquiry. This isn't evasion, it's cognitive redirection. He trained people to accept that direct answers weren't necessary, that mystery was superior to clarity, that confusion was a sign of deep truth rather than poor communication. This is psychological grooming on a massive scale, conditioning entire populations to abandon rational discourse in favor of faith-based acceptance. The paradox technique also created what social psychologists call cognitive sunk cost. Once people had invested significant mental energy trying to understand Jesus's contradictions, admitting they made no sense felt like admitting they had wasted their time and intelligence. It became psychologically easier to believe the paradoxes were profound rather than nonsensical. Jesus also weaponized what neuroscientists call pattern recognition override. The human brain is constantly seeking patterns and meaning in information. When Jesus presented contradictory statements, people's minds would work overtime trying to find hidden connections and deeper truths. This intense mental effort created a false sense of insight. People felt they had discovered something profound when they had actually just exhausted their analytical faculties. Perhaps most brilliantly, Jesus made paradox feel like a test of worthiness. Only the pure in heart could understand his teachings. Only those with true faith could grasp his meaning. This transformed intellectual confusion into spiritual pride. People didn't want to admit they couldn't understand, so they pretended the nonsense made perfect sense. This created a social proof cascade. When surrounded by others who claimed to understand the paradoxes, individuals felt pressure to agree rather than appear spiritually deficient. Soon, entire communities were validating logical contradictions as profound truths, creating an echo chamber where reason couldn't survive. The result was the most successful ideological control system in human history, one that made subjects grateful for their mental chains and suspicious of anyone who offered to unlock them. Let me give you the final analogy that will make everything about Jesus's psychological control system crystal clear. And it might disturb you. Think of the human mind as a sophisticated security system protecting a valuable vault of beliefs, values, and identity. This system has multiple layers: logical analysis, emotional processing, social verification, and pattern recognition. Most people trying to change your mind are like obvious burglars. They trigger all the alarms and get rejected immediately. Jesus was different. He was like a master hacker who didn't break into your mental security system. He reprogrammed it from the inside. First, he used stories to slip past your conscious defenses, like a Trojan horse carrying psychological viruses disguised as entertainment. These stories embedded themselves in your emotional and visual memory systems, creating new neural pathways that bypassed rational analysis. Then, he used scarcity to activate your brain's addiction circuits, making you crave more contact with him while ensuring that craving could never be fully satisfied. Like a skilled drug dealer, he gave you just enough to get hooked, never enough to feel complete. Finally, he used paradox to completely disable your logical security protocols. Instead of trying to overcome your rational mind, he made you voluntarily shut it down. He convinced you that confusion was clarity, that contradiction was truth, and that the failure to understand was actually a sign of spiritual superiority. The genius of this system is that once installed, it becomes self-protecting and self-replicating. Anyone who tries to point out the logical flaws gets labeled as lacking faith. Anyone who questions the contradictions gets accused of spiritual blindness. Anyone who resists the stories gets identified as hard-hearted. The victim becomes the system's most passionate defender, spreading the same psychological viruses to new hosts while feeling like they're sharing profound wisdom. It's the perfect mental trap, one that makes the prisoner love their cell and guard it jealously against anyone who might offer freedom. This is why Jesus' influence has survived for 2 millennia, while conquering empires crumbled and brilliant philosophies were forgotten. He wasn't just teaching ideas, he was installing a psychological operating system that made people psychologically incapable of rejecting him. Modern cult leaders, authoritarian politicians, and manipulative partners all use variations of these same 3 techniques: story-based emotional programming, scarcity-induced addiction, and paradox-based logical shutdown. But none have ever combined them as masterfully as the carpenter from Nazareth who conquered the world without an army. So there you have it, the 3 hidden laws that made Jesus the ultimate master of psychological influence. Narrative programming through incomplete stories, addiction creation through strategic scarcity, and critical thinking destruction through weaponized paradox. These weren't religious teachings. They were mind control techniques so sophisticated that we're only now beginning to understand how they work. Whether you see Jesus as divine or human, you cannot deny the psychological genius of his methods. He didn't just gather followers, he rewired the fundamental architecture of human cognition itself. And that code is still running in billions of minds today, 2,000 years after the programmer died. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need my next videos. But only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful influence secrets in history. What's your opinion about these techniques? Comment below. Send this to that friend with sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on psychological interpretation of historical texts, not clinical diagnosis. The content is intended for educational purposes about influence techniques and should not be considered definitive historical or psychological assessment.